My sister sold my house while I was on vacation, so I sued her for every cent. Before we begin the story, make sure to subscribe to our channel and never miss more incredible stories every day. I had been hiking for 6 weeks, but the real survival test began when a stranger opened my front door and told me to get off his property. My name is Elias. I am 32 years old, a structural engineer by trade, and I view the world through the lens of load-bearing walls, material stress, and undeniable facts. After a grueling 42-day off-grid expedition through the deep backcountry of Alaska, my body was battered. My muscles ached, my boots were crusted in dried mud, and all I wanted was the absolute sanctuary of the home I had spent 2 years renovating with my own 2 hands. I pulled my truck into the driveway, killed the engine, and let out a long breath. But as I walked up the concrete path I had poured myself, a cold, mechanical wrongness settled over my senses. My heavy brass deadbolt, a specialized high-security lock I had installed to perfection, had been completely swapped out for a cheap, flimsy commercial cylinder. I stared at it, my exhausted brain struggling to process the visual data. I slid my key into the keyway. It didn't fit. The metal jammed halfway. I tried to force it, the jagged edges grinding against the wrong pins, when the door suddenly swung inward. A man in his late 40s, reeking of stale nicotine and cheap, overpowering cologne, stood in my foyer. He was wearing an unbuttoned polo shirt and holding a half-empty beer bottle. "Can I help you, buddy?" he barked, his voice dripping with aggressive annoyance. I blinked, looking past his shoulder at my living room. My custom oak bookshelves were gone. The leather sofa I bought with my first big bonus was missing, replaced by cheap folding tables and stacked cardboard boxes. "Who the hell are you?" I demanded, the adrenaline instantly vaporizing my exhaustion. "And what are you doing inside my house?" The man sneered, taking a step forward to physically block the doorway, his chest puffed out in a pathetic display of dominance. "Your house? Pal, you're trespassing. I own this property. You have exactly 10 seconds to get off my porch before I call the cops and have you dragged out of here in handcuffs." The sheer audacity of his statement was paralyzing. The nightmare was just beginning, and my sanctuary was gone. To comprehend the sheer magnitude of this violation, you have to understand the foundational mechanics of how I acquired this property. I didn't just buy a house. I engineered a sanctuary. 3 years ago, I purchased a dilapidated mid-century suburban shell that most contractors deemed to tear down. But I saw the structural bones. I spent every weekend, every holiday, and every spare dollar reinforcing the floor joists, upgrading the electrical grid to a modern 200-amp service, and hanging perfectly plumbed drywall. I bled into the very mortar of that foundation. It was the only place on earth where I felt completely insulated from the chaotic noise of the world. It was my physical proof of stability. Once the final coat of paint dried and the inspections passed, I decided to reward myself. I planned a rigorous 6-week solo expedition through the Alaskan wilderness. Total grid detachment. No cell towers, no internet, no emergency contact numbers. Just me, a compass, and absolute silence. It was an exercise in mental endurance and self-reliance. I meticulously prepped my property for the prolonged vacancy. I drained the exterior pipes to prevent freezing, calibrated the smart thermostat to maintain a steady ambient temperature, and secured the perimeter windows. The only variable I couldn't completely control was the mail accumulation and the unpredictable nature of suburban emergencies, like a burst water main or a freak electrical storm. I needed a physical failsafe, someone to hold a spare key and check on the internal structure once a week. I looked at my limited circle and made the most catastrophic miscalculation of my entire adult life. I decided to trust my older sister, Sarah. She lived 20 minutes away, and despite our profound differences, we shared the same blood. I assumed that biological connection carried a baseline of loyalty. I assumed she understood the value of hard work. I was viewing human behavior through a logical, structural lens, completely ignoring the corrosive rust of her secret desperation. I handed her the brass key, entirely unaware I was handing away my home. Sarah is 35, and her entire existence has always been a fragile, carefully curated facade of unearned luxury. While I studied load capacities and structural dynamics, she chased the aesthetics of wealth. At the time I left for Alaska, she was running a boutique event planning startup that she leased an exorbitant downtown office for. Every time I saw her, She was flashing a new designer handbag or talking about her high society clients. But beneath that glossy veneer, the structural integrity of her life was buckling under massive, invisible debt. The week before my flight, she came over to pick up the key. I was packing my titanium camp stove when she casually, almost dismissively, asked if she could borrow $5,000. Just a temporary cash flow issue with the business, she lied, her eyes darting nervously around my living room. A major client is late on an invoice. I gave her a hard no. I told her my liquid assets were tied up in the house renovations and the expedition gear. She tightened her jaw, a flash of bitter resentment crossing her face, but quickly masked it with a tight, plastic smile. No problem, Elias. I totally get it. Have a safe trip. I handed her the heavy brass deadbolt key. I specifically instructed her to only enter the property if there was a visible emergency, like a storm casualty or a tripped breaker alarm. She pocketed the metal, promising to keep my sanctuary secure. I boarded my flight to Anchorage feeling completely at peace, plunging into the deep, cellular silence of the wilderness. For 42 days, I didn't think about money, mortgages, or family drama. I navigated glaciers and survived off freeze-dried rations, completely oblivious to the financial slaughter occurring 2,000 miles away in my own living room. While I was conquering physical mountains, Sarah was drowning in a catastrophic financial abyss of her own making, and my empty house looked like the perfect life raft. The desperation of a sinking ship will make monsters out of your own blood. The transition back to civilization is always jarring, but returning to my neighborhood felt distinctly, physically wrong. The taxi dropped me off at the end of my suburban street because a moving van was blocking the intersection. I hoisted my heavy pack, the straps digging into my collarbones, and began the short walk to my driveway. My brain, trained to recognize spatial anomalies, immediately detected severe disruptions. My restored vintage pickup truck, which I had parked securely against the far wall of the driveway, was missing. In its place sat a scratched, mud-splattered black SUV. I stopped on the sidewalk, my heart rate accelerating. I scanned the exterior elevation of the house. The custom cedar window boxes I had built and sealed with marine varnish were gone, replaced by cheap plastic planters. The thick, blackout curtains I had installed in the living room had been torn down, and ugly, off-white vertical blinds hung in the windows. Even the mailbox, a heavy-gauge steel box I had bolted to an iron post, had been swapped out for a generic tin unit. Every single external marker of my ownership had been surgically erased. I unclipped the sternum strap of my backpack, the heavy mechanical click sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet suburban air. My logical mind tried to construct a rational explanation. A prank? A catastrophic misunderstanding by a local landscaping crew? But the presence of the stranger's SUV negated those theories. I walked up the poured concrete path, my heavy boots silent on the aggregate. That was when I noticed the front door lock. The brass deadbolt was gone. I tried to insert my key, experiencing the grating, metallic rejection of the wrong cylinder, leading to the moment the door swung open and Greg stood there, aggressively claiming my property. I stared at his cheap cologne and the cheap folding tables inside my living room. He wasn't a burglar. He was too comfortable. The realization hit me with the crushing weight of a collapsing concrete wall. Call the police, I told Greg, my voice dropping an octave into a cold, mechanical register. Call them right now. Because if you don't, I will. Greg smirked, an ugly, arrogant twist of his lips, and pulled a bulky smartphone from his pocket. He dialed 911 with exaggerated, theatrical confidence. I stood on the porch, my muscles vibrating with adrenaline, calculating the physical layout of the room behind him just in case he tried to assault me. 10 minutes later, a local cruiser pulled up, its lights flashing silently against the suburban houses. Two uniformed officers stepped out, their hands resting cautiously on their duty belts. I approached them immediately, presenting my driver's license. Officers, my name is Elias. This is my property. I've been out of the country for 6 weeks, and I've come home to find this man trespassing inside my locked house. The older officer nodded, turning his attention to Greg, who was leaning against the doorframe, looking completely unbothered. Sir, step outside and identify yourself, the cop ordered. Greg sighed, walked back into the house, and returned a moment later holding a thick manila envelope. He didn't pull out an ID. He pulled out a stack of paper. "Officers, this guy is a loon," Greg said smoothly, handing the documents to the police. "I bought this property 2 weeks ago. Here is the stamped, recorded deed, the title transfer, and my proof of identification." The officer shined his heavy flashlight onto the paperwork. I watched the beam of light scan over the crisp, official county seal. The cop looked at the paper, looked at Greg's ID, and then turned to look at me with a mixture of profound pity and bureaucratic detachment. The structural foundation of my reality fractured. It wasn't a break-in. It was a hostile, legally documented takeover. The paperwork was flawless, and I was instantly rendered a trespasser on my own land. "I'm sorry, Elias," the older officer said, handing the documents back to Greg. "The deed is registered in his name. The county seal is authentic. We cannot force him to vacate the premises." I stared at the cop, the blood roaring in my ears like a jet engine. "It's my house. I have the original mortgage. I never signed anything." The officer held up a gloved hand to stop me. "If you believe this is fraudulent, you need to take it to civil court. But right now, legally, he is the property owner. You have to leave, or I will have to arrest you for trespassing." The cold, mechanical reality of the law clamped down on me like a steel vise. I wasn't going to win a shouting match on the porch. I grabbed my heavy backpack, turning my back on Greg's smug, punchable face, and walked away from my own home. I called a taxi and directed the driver to a cheap, neon-lit motel on the industrial edge of the city. I checked into a dingy room that smelled strongly of stale cigarette smoke and industrial bleach. The flickering fluorescent light in the bathroom hummed with a maddening, electrical buzz. I dropped my pack on the stained carpet, pulled out my rugged field laptop, and tethered it to my phone's cellular connection. I didn't sleep. For 10 solid hours, fueled by instant coffee and pure, unadulterated rage, I hacked through the county's public real estate portals. I needed to see the architecture of the fraud. I paid the exorbitant digital access fees to pull the full historical transaction log for my parcel. The progress bar crawled across the screen, each pixel building the horrific picture of what had happened while I was completely unreachable in the wild. I stared at the glowing screen, my eyes burning from exhaustion, as the PDF finally rendered the official transfer documents. I zoomed in on the signature line, my breath catching in my throat as I saw the impossible ink. The digital file revealed a terrifying forgery that completely erased my legal existence. At 8 a.m. sharp, I was standing outside the heavy glass doors of the county clerk's office, shivering slightly in the crisp morning air. My clothes still smelled like campfire smoke, but my mind was operating with the cold precision of a forensic accountant. When the doors unlocked, I marched directly to the records department and requested the physical, hard copy file for my property address. The clerk, a bored-looking woman peering over thick spectacles, handed me a thick gray folder. I took it to a sterile, brightly lit viewing table in the corner of the room. I opened the file, laying the documents out like pieces of a gruesome crime scene. First was the quitclaim deed, transferring absolute ownership from my name to Greg's newly formed LLC. I looked at the seller's signature. It was an almost perfect replica of my handwriting, right down to the aggressive slant of the E. But underneath the deed was the true mechanical linchpin of the entire scam, a general power of attorney document. This document legally granted a third party the absolute, unrestricted right to sell, mortgage, or transfer my real estate on my behalf. I stared at the name printed in the agent box, the ink stark and black against the white paper. Sarah Jenkins, my sister. The document claimed I had authorized her to liquidate my assets before I left the country. It was stamped, signed, and embossed by a licensed notary public, authenticating the blatant lie. The sheer, mechanical audacity of the paperwork was breathtaking. She hadn't just stolen a TV or maxed out a credit card. She had engineered a highly complex, multi-stage legal fraud to completely sever my ownership of the house, using the very emergency key I had given her as her primary weapon of infiltration. I dragged my finger across the embossed notary seal, feeling the raised bumps of the stamp, knowing that this tiny impression of metal had been used to obliterate years of my grueling labor and financial sacrifice. The blueprint of her betrayal was perfectly laid out in black and white ink. The puzzle pieces locked together with sickening, mathematical precision. Sarah was the only person on Earth who knew the exact parameters of my expedition. She knew I would be completely, physically unreachable. No emails, no calls, no texts, for exactly 42 days. It was the perfect, silent vacuum required to execute a complex real estate transaction without triggering any alarms from the actual owner. I flipped to the financial settlement statement at the back of the county file. The numbers hit me like a physical blow to the chest. Greg, the sleazy buyer, hadn't paid market value. My meticulously renovated home, easily worth $450,000, had been quick-sold for $250,000. Pure raw cash. No mortgage contingencies, no grueling bank inspections, just a fast, dirty wire transfer to a newly established trust account controlled entirely by Sarah. She had butchered my sanctuary and sold the meat at wholesale prices to a predatory flipper who clearly didn't care about the massive, glowing red flags surrounding the deal. $250,000. That was the price tag she put on my life's work, my security, and our biological relationship. I imagined her sitting in her leased, fake luxury boutique, drowning in late notices and eviction threats, looking at my spare key on her desk. The desperation must have been absolute to attempt a felony of this magnitude. But understanding the load dynamics of a collapsing structure doesn't mean you forgive the gravity that destroys it. I packed the photocopied documents into my bag, walking out of the sterile county building with a newfound, terrifying clarity. I wasn't just going to get my house back. I was going to dismantle her life. I walked out of the sterile county building, the glaring midday sun blinding my exhausted eyes, with a newfound, terrifying clarity burning in my chest. I wasn't just going to get my house back from these thieves. I was going to systematically dismantle her entire fraudulent existence. I needed a legal mercenary who understood how to execute a flawless financial slaughter. I didn't bother calling a family lawyer or a friendly neighborhood attorney. I used the motel's terrible Wi-Fi to research aggressive real estate litigation firms, filtering for the most ruthless, heavily penalized track records in the state. I found Mr. Miller. His office wasn't in a flashy downtown high-rise. It was in a heavily fortified, wood-paneled building near the federal courthouse. Miller was in his late 50s, possessing the cold, dead-eyed stare of a great white shark and the precise vocabulary of a neurosurgeon. I sat across from his massive mahogany desk and laid out the forged power of attorney, the quick cash settlement statement, and the timeline of my off-grid expedition. Miller didn't express sympathy or shock. He simply analyzed the data. "This is a brazen conversion," Miller said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "Your sister committed grand theft, forgery, and wire fraud. The buyer, Greg, likely committed willful blindness or outright conspiracy to purchase a distressed asset at an absurd discount. The title agent who cleared this garbage is criminally negligent." He picked up a solid gold pen, tapping it rhythmically against the legal pad. "The house is physically occupied, and the cash is likely already bleeding out of her accounts. We are not going to send polite demand letters, Elias. We are going to drop a tactical nuclear weapon on all of them simultaneously." He began mapping the legal war on a whiteboard. A quiet title action to freeze the property. A civil RICO claim to terrify the buyer. Ex parte emergency motions to freeze every single bank account associated with Sarah's social security number. It was a beautiful, mechanical blueprint for absolute legal destruction. "We will strangle their capital," Miller explained, drawing a harsh red line through Sarah's name on the board. "By the time I'm done with the initial filings, your sister won't be able to buy a cup of coffee without a judge's permission, and Greg will realize he bought a radioactive asset." Before the legal missiles launched, I needed to look my betrayer in the eyes. I left Miller's office and drove my rental car directly to the upscale, high-rent shopping district where Sarah had leased the storefront for her failing boutique. The shop was an exercise in absurd vanity. Minimalist white walls, sparse racks of overpriced candles, and aggressive, generic abstract art. I walked through the glass door, the small chime announcing my arrival. Sarah was behind the marble counter, typing frantically on a sleek silver laptop. When she looked up and saw my face, all the blood instantly drained from her cheeks. She looked like a ghost, physically shrinking back against the shelving. "Elias," she gasped, her voice trembling violently. You're back early. You weren't supposed to be back until Sunday." I didn't yell. I didn't scream. I pulled my phone from my pocket, visibly pressed the bright red record button, and placed it flat on the pristine marble counter between us. "Where is the $250,000, Sarah?" I asked, my voice completely devoid of emotion, sounding more like a machine than a brother. The coldness broke her. She collapsed into a pathetic, weeping mess, her carefully applied makeup running down her face in dark streaks. "I was going to pay you back," she sobbed hysterically, gripping the edge of the counter to keep from falling. "The business was going under, Elias. The loan sharks were threatening my life. I just needed a bridge loan. I was going to flip a massive corporate event next month, buy the house back from Greg, and you never would have known." The sheer, staggering delusion of her logic was mind-boggling. She honestly believed she could secretly sell my home, gamble the cash on a failing business, and magically reverse a recorded real estate transaction before I finished my hike. Her confession was captured perfectly on the digital audio file sitting on the counter. "You didn't borrow money," I said coldly, picking up my phone and saving the recording to a secure cloud server. "You stole my sanctuary. And now, you are going to lose absolutely everything." I turned and walked out of the boutique, ignoring her hysterical screams echoing into the street. Within 48 hours, Mr. Miller executed the legal strikes with terrifying, synchronized precision. He filed the quiet title lawsuit in the county superior court, slapping a lease pendens, a notice of pending litigation, directly onto the property deed. This legal red flag meant Greg couldn't sell, refinance, or leverage the house. It was financially paralyzed. Simultaneously, Miller presented my expedition satellite GPS logs, my passport stamps, and the audio confession to a judge. The judge immediately granted an emergency ex parte order, instantly freezing every personal and business bank account tied to Sarah. The mechanical swiftness of the justice system, when properly weaponized by a brilliant lawyer, is a sight to behold. Sarah's boutique was padlocked by the landlord within a week because her auto-draft rent payments bounced against the frozen accounts. Her leased luxury SUV was repossessed from her driveway in the middle of the night. The $250,000 of my equity that she had stolen was mostly trapped in those frozen accounts, though she had already burned through $40,000 paying off her aggressive private lenders. The trap had snapped completely shut on her fragile, fake life, crushing it into dust. But the legal war was only half over. We still had to deal with the arrogant squatter sitting in my living room, convinced he had outsmarted the system. Greg thought he could hide behind the shield of being a bona fide purchaser for value, claiming ignorance of the fraud. But Miller knew exactly how to dismantle that defense, exposing the corrupt machinery Greg used to fast-track the illegal purchase. The sleazy real estate flipper was about to experience the full wrath of discovery. Greg wasn't just a victim who bought the wrong house. He was a predatory opportunist who ignored massive, screaming red flags to score a cheap asset. Through aggressive subpoenas, Mr. Miller acquired all of Greg's text messages, emails, and financial communications with the corrupt notary and the shady title agent who pushed the fraudulent closing through in record time. The documents revealed a sickening timeline. Greg had actively rushed the title search, explicitly telling the agent via text to ignore the discrepancies on the PO. Just get the damn stamp on the paper so we can close before the owner gets back. He knew it was dirty. He just didn't care. Despite this overwhelming evidence, Greg refused to settle or vacate the property. He hired his own aggressive defense attorney, acting tough and arrogant, claiming my lawsuit was a desperate shakedown. He even had the audacity to send me a text message from his personal phone, mocking my situation. "Nice try, buddy. I have title insurance and a signed deed. Enjoy the cheap motel." I forwarded the text directly to Miller. The lawyer just smiled, a cold, predatory grimace that sent a chill down my spine. "Let him talk," Miller advised, meticulously organizing a massive stack of subpoenaed bank records into a thick binder. "Arrogance is the mortar that holds a stupid man's defense together. When we get him under oath, I am going to systematically shatter every single brick in his foundation." The date for the official, recorded depositions was set, and the battlefield shifted from the Public Records Office to a sterile, heavily air-conditioned conference room downtown. I spent the night before the deposition reviewing the timeline, committing every date, every wire transfer, and every forged signature to memory. I was prepared to watch Greg's smug confidence completely evaporate under the brutal, fluorescent lights of legal scrutiny. The deposition room was entirely silent as the court reporter prepared the stenography machine. The conference room was freezing cold, the long mahogany table acting as the battle line. Greg sat across from us, wearing a flashy suit, chewing gum with exaggerated arrogance. Sarah sat next to him, representing herself because she couldn't afford an attorney with her frozen assets. She looked utterly destroyed, pale, shaking, staring blankly at the wood grain. Mr. Miller didn't waste time with pleasantries. He activated his digital recorder and began dissecting them with clinical, surgical precision. He started with the fake power of attorney. Miller slid a document across the table. Greg, please read the date of the notary's stamp authenticating Sarah's authority to sell the house. Greg sneered, glancing at the paper. October 14th. So what? Miller leaned forward, his eyes locking onto Greg like a targeting laser. October 14th was a Sunday. The notary public whose stamp is on that document, Mr. Arthur Vance, testified yesterday that his stamp was stolen from his vehicle on October 12th. Furthermore, my client's GPS beacon proves he was exactly 2,000 miles away in the Alaskan tundra on that date, making it physically impossible for him to have signed anything. Greg's chewing completely stopped. The smug color instantly drained from his face as he looked at his defense attorney, who was now aggressively rubbing his temples in despair. Miller then played the audio recording of Sarah confessing to the theft, her hysterical voice echoing loudly off the wood-paneled walls. The mechanical breakdown of their conspiracy was absolute and undeniable. The fraudulent foundation they had built was entirely pulverized into dust. Greg's lawyer immediately called for a recess, practically dragging his client out into the hallway to negotiate a total surrender. Sarah just sat there, weeping silently into her hands, finally understanding the catastrophic magnitude of the prison sentence looming over her head. The silence in the room after the recording finished playing was the heaviest, most satisfying sound I had ever heard. The arrogant squatter had finally realized he was holding a legally radioactive piece of paper. The legal collapse was swift and absolute. Knowing that a trial would result in devastating punitive damages and almost certain criminal charges for conspiracy, Greg's attorney forced him to immediately surrender. The judge signed a permanent order voiding the fraudulent deed entirely, legally erasing the fake sale from the county records as if it had never occurred. The quiet title action was successful. The house was officially, undeniably mine again. Greg lost his entire $250,000 cash investment, which remained frozen in Sarah's accounts, subject to massive legal penalties and restitution claims. He tried to sue his corrupt title agent to recoup the loss, but the agent had already fled the state, leaving Greg holding the empty bag of his own greed. As for Sarah, the district attorney didn't offer any leniency. The audio confession, combined with the stolen notary stamp and the massive wire fraud, resulted in a federal indictment. She was formally charged with multiple counts of grand theft, forgery, and wire fraud. She is currently awaiting trial, living in a cramped, depressing halfway house, facing a mandatory minimum of 5 years in a federal penitentiary. Our parents tried to guilt-trip me into dropping the civil damages against her, claiming that family is family. I coldly informed them that if they continued to harass me, I would file restraining orders against them as well. The emotional cord had been cleanly, surgically severed. I had engineered a flawless legal retaliation, ensuring that the people who tried to destroy my life were caught in the crushing gears of the justice system they thought they could manipulate. The paper trail they created became their very own noose. I watched the court clerk stamp the final, official judgment with a heavy, mechanical thud, feeling the massive weight of the last 6 months finally lift from my chest. The war was officially over, and the invaders had been completely eradicated from my territory. The only thing left to do was physically reclaim the space they had violated. 2 days after the judge signed the final order, I stood on my front porch with a licensed locksmith. The crisp suburban air felt entirely different this time. I watched with quiet, profound satisfaction as the locksmith drilled out the cheap commercial cylinder Greg had installed, the metal shavings falling onto the concrete like dust. He installed a massive, heavy-duty smart lock, handing me the single master key. I walked inside my house. It was completely empty. Greg had panic moved all of his cheap furniture out in the middle of the night to avoid further trespass charges. The rooms echoed with my footsteps, smelling faintly of cleaning chemicals and stale air. It wasn't the warm, comfortable sanctuary I had left 6 months ago, but the structural integrity was intact. The bones of the house, the load-bearing walls, the reinforced joists, the solid foundation, were still exactly where I built them. I spent the next week meticulously scrubbing the floors, repainting the walls, and ordering new furniture to replace the pieces Sarah had sold off. The physical labor was cathartic, a mechanical process of washing away the taint of their betrayal. The hardest lesson I learned from this visceral nightmare is that blood does not guarantee loyalty, and blind trust is a catastrophic vulnerability. Greed is a corrosive force that will eat through the strongest familial bonds if given the opportunity. You must engineer your life with boundaries, alarms, and absolute accountability. My house is quiet now, fortified by legal precedent and heavy steel deadbolts. I look at the new brass key in my hand, knowing exactly what it cost to keep it. I pour myself a strong cup of black coffee and stand by the large front window, watching the neighborhood wake up in the morning light. The nightmare of the stolen deed and the motel room feels like a distant, fading memory against the solid reality of my own home. You can never truly appreciate the absolute safety of a fortress until it survives a siege.